It is a new year, and I have decided to pay attention to the fashion industry because, as we all know from that very, very famous scene in The Devil Wears Prada, whether you like it or not, this stuff affects you. And it affects me as someone who makes fashion content. So, for this Paris Fall Winter Fashion Week, I have been taking notes, I have been looking at the clothes and reading reviews and reading the show notes. And I do want to talk about the trends, but I want to talk about them in two different ways because obviously different companies approach the fashion show problem differently, right? It's like a creative prompt. And I find that there were two main camps. Not everyone fell into this, but there were two main camps. There were some shows that were very conceptual, so they seemed more concerned with reacting or discussing our current political, cultural, social moment. And then there were shows, I would say, that were really concerned with how people wear clothes. Like, they styled shows the way that people would wear their clothes in real life. There was a realism to it. There was like a tangibility to these outfits. And I think there were trends in both camps. So I think there were a couple of concepts or political ideas that multiple brands were giving their take on. And there were specific clothing items that different brands were giving their take on. So I want to go over both. The first show I want to talk about is Walter van Beirendonck. He's a fairly well-known designer. I don't think he has as much commercial or popular success as some others, but he's been around for a very long time and is very well respected, and he is weird. And he has been weird for as long as he's been designing. I want to start with him because in some ways he was sort of admonishing the general fashion collective. He said, "The boom of vintage or archival clothing, although a fantastic step towards a more sustainable fashion world, makes for few interesting or unseen volumes walking the streets. The nostalgia for the looks of old subcultures leave little space for mind-blowing new techniques, applications, or cuts to land on the runways." And so the theme of the show essentially was aliens. He wants to do something that's alien to us. He wants to do something that's new. Of course, there's a lot of ties, there's a lot of suiting. I do think the reimagined suit is always going to be a hot topic at Men's Fashion Week. There's a lot of plaids, there's a lot of checks, and there's these elongated alien fingers. Generally, I find that Walter van Beirendonck is going to walk his own lane. He's not necessarily going to be taken in by the more specific fashion trends of the moment. I do think it's interesting because a lot of shows have tried to talk about sustainability in the past couple of years, which is obviously hard to do when you're selling new clothes. But for instance, Willy Chavarria's show this season, I believe he bought some of his old pieces off of eBay and put them back on the runway. So he's interested in this sort of circularity that Walter van Beirendonck is essentially rejecting. After each model walked the show, they sat down in these little alien chairs and then held up the peace sign. I think this obviously is a reference to the, we come in peace. It also makes me think his turn to this idea of the peaceful, gentle alien is a little bit of a rejection of our earthly warmongering and what I'm sure he considers our petty divisions. He's looking towards the future, right? He's imagining something better for us, which I think insinuates that he's not happy with our present moment. This brings me to Comme des Garçons' Homme Plus collection for Fall/Winter 25, which more literally is named To Hell with War. Though I would not call this a trend, I do think it's interesting that both Walter and Comme des Garçons this season are featuring these big, bulbous, helmet-like hats. Obviously, for Comme des Garçons, it's because my take, at least, is they're essentially making a mockery of the military. It's a military-inspired collection, but only so that it can take the visual elements of the thing that it's trying to critique. The collection notes apparently were very brief. It just said, breaking down army symbols, such as uniform shapes, color, camouflage patterns, helmets. Again, more conceptual, not super focused on what people are wearing walking down the street. Not super focused on building an easy and interchangeable modular wardrobe, right? Again, Comme des Garçons has its audience, it has its codes, it has its particular deconstructed style, but it does seem particularly aware this season of the state of the world, though they have approached it in a distinctly different way than the Walter van Beirendonck collection. I'm also feeling like, yeah, we have a couple of really bad conflicts going on right now, but don't we always sort of have conflicts going on? Has there been a point in my life where there were no wars happening? I don't know. Anyway, it does seem like in terms of the media, sometimes it's more at the forefront of people's minds and sometimes it's just less. But not every show that was conceptual was interested in our political climate. Both the Dior and the Rick Owens shows were a little bit more inwards looking. The Dior show was looking at some of the older and original designs, and the Rick Owens show was, they're calling it autobiographical. So it's sort of about Rick Owens's own journey through his brand. Kim Jones is the current creative director for Dior Men. I really liked a lot of this. My favorite looks were probably the button-downs with what looked like really voluminous pants and what turned out to be a coat worn backwards. So I guess in some ways it's more of a skirt than pants. I don't know how they're gonna sell these. Like, I kind of hope they make them into pants because I think that would be more wearable and a big hit. They just look really beautiful and elegant, and I like the silhouette that they went for, where you have this sort of short triangle on top and it really nips in at the waist. I also liked these hybrid sweater cardigan tops because obviously for a fall winter collection, and in the shows I'm going to show you later, there are a lot of layered cardigan looks, and this feels like a little bit of a play on that. The Rick Owens show is called Concordians. The title is a nod to Concordia, Italy, which is where the brand's factory is, so that's where the clothing is made. The show explores his relationship with that town and his factory and how much time he spends there and his feelings being in that industrial space. Though I do think because Rick Owens as a brand and a man has always been about being this sort of outsider, being queer, wearing your difference on your sleeve, or in this case, in your outfit, I'm sure he doesn't particularly feel like he needs to make a statement with this specific collection. The one thing I did pick up on was his use of texture in this show. It almost looks like feathers, and obviously for fall winter, fur and down are very traditional because you're using them to keep warm. It also sort of reminded me of the way Sacai used textures in their collection this year. The designer for Sacai, Chitose Abe, was focused on where the wild things are as a reference point for this collection, which you can see comes through with all the fuzziness and the fur. And just the use of textures sort of coming out of these different parts of the garment really did remind me of the Rick collection in that way. But overall, I just really loved the textures that Rick is bringing, these folds and these feathers and this fabric. Of course, I'm not going to say fur is a trend. They're winter collections. Leather is not a trend. Fur is not a trend. Dark colors are not a trend. Scarves are not a trend. A puffer coat is not a trend. I'm not going to keep going, but there are some things that are just not trends. It's just that it's a fall winter collection. But there were a couple of trendy items that showed up in the Sacai collection where it seemed like they wanted to give their take on that trendy moment. The biggest one for me, of course, is the duffel coat motif, which if you didn't see that video, I did a little explainer on the history of the duffel coat and the fact that it is in style once again. The duffel coat sort of comes back and goes away and comes back again, and it is certainly back this year. My main issue with the duffel coat is that I do think something about it feels a little juvenile. I don't know why, I just think that a lot of kids wore duffel coats in the past 20 years, and now we're trying to make it a thing for adults again. Maybe it's the Paddington Association, but I think the fact that they cropped the coat so it's not a full-length coat helps a lot to differentiate it. They also made the rope closures go across the entire coat instead of sort of just being centered on the middle. I think that looks very nice as well. It's almost a stripe. But my favorite part is probably when they do these like sort of deconstructed looks with these little furry, fringy moments. It's actually a pretty big collection, and a huge part of it is their collaboration with Carhartt WIP, Work in Progress. There obviously is and has been a great fascination with American workwear in Japan and with Japanese designers, and I want to talk about Junya Watanabe because I think they took that to the next level for their collection. I liked it. I think some of the feelings about it were like, why do we need this? Like, why do we need to have Junya Watanabe do lumber sexual? We've seen this before. We can get it from many, many different American workwear companies that have sprung up. So I think people were kind of just feeling like this image, this idea, this market is already a little oversaturated, and we potentially don't need Junya Watanabe MAN to wade into that pool as well. I was listening to Brenda Hashtag's podcast, and she was at the show, I believe, and it was funny. I liked her take on it because she was just like, it was hot, it was sexy, like, look at all these hot bearded men. Which I think if you're at that fashion show, I can totally see you walking away with that impression, being like, what a hot show, I had a great time. My take about this collection is just like it felt a little bit like a very specific Pinterest board come to life, right? We know that guy, we've seen that guy. He's a great guy. He's a lovely looking guy. But yeah, it just felt like in some ways a reproduction of that, and that's also because it is partially about reproductions. So this show was all about collaborations. They collaborated with Levi's, they collaborated with New Balances. Honestly, these New Balances are pretty cute. I want to get a better look at them. But also some of the shoes that they were showing were just like the shoes of the moment. They were just showing boat shoes. These boat shoes, I believe, are by Henrik Dinkelacker. And then they also just had the paraboot hikers go down the runway. So it just felt very much like this is what's hot right now. But it also, I was reading, I think, a Vogue article about it, and it was like, this happened in the 2010s. Like, we did this during the hipster era. Buffalo plaid was everywhere, and we don't need it again. But, you know, things are always going to come back. I think they just thought it had come back too quickly. But yeah, I think we've reached the part of the video where the fashion is looking very much like what you've already seen online. And it's just funny to me because these shows are obviously supposed to be forward looking. They're supposed to be future looking. So like, this is what we'll be wearing next fall and winter. But I'm like, people are already wearing this fall and winter. So I don't know. It's not like designers have to be so ahead of the times and so far reaching, but I'm not sure how much I love when it's just like completely of the moment. Like literally, this is what's popular right now. Here it is on the runway. Americana is hot, I get it. And this is how the Americana guys are wearing it. Speaking of realistic styling, I want to talk about Auralee. They had, of course, I'm an Auralee simp like everybody else. They had a fabulous collection. I thought it was so beautiful and cute. And it just really looks like people wearing the clothes. And I just really like the styling. I really liked the styling of this collection. So let's look at it. Some of the layering was like a little rumpled, a little askew. They also had these like mittens as a neck accessory instead of like a scarf. I don't know. You don't see a lot of mittens being styled on the runway. So I thought that was very nice. And then you have some stuff that's just like, you know, it's a little visually interesting. Like here's a guy who's probably coming back from work, but he has this little red techie backpack instead of a briefcase. You know, that cute pop of color. He's like a real guy. Who knows where he got that backpack? You have this guy who's wearing a suit with a hoodie, which honestly reminds me a little bit of the guy character, I forget his name, in Baby Girl, because the whole idea is that he's not supposed to be particularly upper class. So he's trying to dress for his fancy internship in nice clothes, but a lot of times his outerwear is not so nice because he can't afford like an overcoat or whatever. So he shows up to work in like kind of a suit, but a warmer layer that is a little bit more casual. This is like a very specific thing I've been thinking about for the last year or two actually, but this particular color blue button down, I keep on seeing, I think COS sells them, I think the Row probably sells them, and it's just a very specific color blue, and I actually have really been wanting one. I'm just so sure that I can thrift one that I haven't bought one new, but I also haven't really been able to thrift one. I think if I put my mind to it, I can, but it's just funny. I feel like I just keep on seeing them and have seen them for a couple seasons now. This was probably one of my favorite looks, just the colors I thought were so beautiful to have these 3 layered sweaters. And then my other favorite were these stripes. The way this is styled, I think, is just like genius, and I don't think I would do this in real life. Well, I don't really wear skirts, but I love a stripe on a stripe. And I love the way they tied it and then they belted it. It looks amazing. I just think it's one of the cutest looks I've seen in a while. And then I also liked, of course, this stripe on a button down. Obviously, I would love to own some of this clothing. And it's very like, it's just so wearable, right? But also these collections really do make me feel like I can make outfits like this from stuff I can find secondhand or stuff that I already own. And so I really think they're just fabulous inspiration. But yes, Auralee, obviously, they're very of the moment. But Auralee, in some ways, I'm like, are they of the moment or did they make the moment? The one kind of new thing, but also something I saw in a couple other collections, were these really cropped leather jackets. Something about it obviously is very 50s to me. Similarly, Lemaire sent a very wearable collection down the runway again. 2 things that I noticed in this collection from Lemaire that I have been seeing a lot of. One is the throat latch. This has been around, I think, for a year or so now. Throat latches are a classic function for a coat, but I just feel like people were not using them. People weren't styling their coats with the throat latch for a pretty long time. And then I feel like about a year ago, they started popping up in inspiration posts and in stores and on the runway that your coat actually has the throat latch and it's, you know, it's functional. That I think is part of a wider trend of like high collar coats that you can wear as high collars and that have some sort of button accessory. I would say like a button motif. That doesn't seem right. They're button forward. You know, the button is part of the design. The other thing I noticed, and I noticed because this is always a good way to catch a trend, is because I started wanting one, is they have these necklaces where it's sort of like a black leather tong and then a big pendant, a big sort of abstract pendant. I saw a couple of influencers I follow wearing necklaces like this, and then now I'm seeing it on the runway here, and so I'm just like, it's in the water, and it does actively feel like it's being sold to me. I'm sure I could make something similar, like I could thrift a big abstract silver pendant and put a leather tongue around it, but I'm very attracted to it right now, and it's just interesting seeing it on the Lemaire runway as well. So, these sorts of collections, I do feel like they're really focused on what people wear, what people want to wear right now, and having just a very beautiful, easily elegant wardrobe. Like, if you just buy the clothes from this brand, you're going to look good. And I think there's certainly a sort of assurance to that people really like. But it's not necessarily, they still have concepts and they still have inspirations, but it's not something necessarily more high-minded than that. I think there were also some shows that sort of bridged the gap between the two camps. So they're showing clothes that are sort of trendy, they're of the moment, they're popular right now, and the show is seemingly responding to current events. The big one being Willy Chavarria, who made his Paris debut, though I'm very sad to lose him from New York Fashion Week, which is struggling, to maintain relevancy and popularity. But anyway, I'm very happy for him to show in Paris. That's wonderful. The show was called Tarantula, and it contends with his personal life, his queerness, his biracial identity, his upbringing in the San Joaquin Valley. There are a lot of immigrant farmers there. It's a working class area. The show notes read, "When the thunder breaks, it breaks for you and me. Under furled heavens, my kiss is as soft and gentle as the hair of a tarantula." Is that from something, actually? It sounds like a quote. Let me see. Oh, okay. The quote is from a song called Tarantula by the band Colorbox. It was a single released in 1982. It's actually been covered a couple different times by This Mortal Coil and Beck. The show took place in a church, and at the end they played a recording of Bishop Marianne Edgar Buddy. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. She gave a sermon, essentially to Donald Trump during his inauguration, asking for compassion for the queer community. And he said straight up to the press, "The message of human dignity and equality and the importance of us coming together to preserve our rights as immigrants, as LGBT people, as women, has never been more important. Our community is very much under attack now." I loved the bold plaids and checks, especially when they were head to toe. And the little tied bandanas, those have been hot in menswear, really hot over the last year. Of course, it's a very classic thing to do, but I still love seeing it. And I particularly loved these very crop wide jackets. Again, sort of evocative to me of the 50s. I'm looking it up now. I think it also was popular in the 1940s, but yeah, these little crop jackets that men had that sort of showed off their natural waist. Obviously, the leather ones that we saw at Auralee, I think gave me a 50s vibe just because I think of, leather motorcycle jackets to be a very 50s thing. But yeah, I think his message just reads differently than the sort of show you saw from Junya Watanabe about workwear and Americana, when it's an American designer who's, I think my interpretation of it at least is, he's using codes from his community and his upbringing and his brand in general, but he's also sort of reclaiming these ideas about American fashion and American ideals by saying this is as much a thing from me and for me as it is for any other type of American. And so when you see these sort of cowboy hats and these bandanas and this religious imagery, it's a claiming of that identity and a sharing of it. He also had a sort of take on a Chanel jacket, which I thought was cute. I wonder if he just did that because he was showing in Paris and it's, an ode to a famous French designer. It reminded me, Sacai did one as well. They had a little take on a Chanel jacket. Again, I don't know, I'm not going to say that's a trend or anything, but I just, I noticed it in both shows, which was fun. Okay, Willy Chavarria, love. I think another brand that was dealing with very similar themes was Egonlab. They called their show Salem, which is supposed to be sort of a reference to the Salem witch trials and the idea that, again, if you're queer or if you're other, you're sort of hunted down and, in that case, killed, I guess, but in other cases, oppressed. Though Egonlab has two French designers, so I believe they're more concerned with the general right-leaning movement in Europe rather than what's going on in the US right now. Again, they're playing with a lot of texture here. So they have fur or a fringe-like texture at the neck and the cuffs. I'm calling this the neck to cuff connection. Otherwise, again, we see these high collars, this leather jacket that can be buttoned all the way up to the top to create a high collar. They also have some denim jackets that you can do the same thing with. The one thing I really didn't like were these long fringe tassels coming out of these holes. I recently saw Blue Man Group for the first time because they are ending their run in New York City, and my partner was like, you should see Blue Man Group, because I had never seen it and he had. And we went. First of all, so bizarre. What a strange show. Like, you could really tell that it was innovative when it came out and now has become something totally disconnected from reality. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff coming out of pipes in that show. There's just like a lot of, there's like kind of, is there vomiting? No, maybe not. But there's just like stuff coming out of PVC pipes. And that's sort of what this reminded me of. And maybe that performance was more traumatic than I thought, because it sort of gives me the ick a little bit. There are just a couple more shows I want to briefly talk about, sort of a rapid round. These shows I would put in a category of being reference and artistically minded. So to start with Setchu, which was technically not Paris, they showed in Milan, but I really liked the collection, so I wanted to talk about it. They were very focused on specific kinds of fabrication and inspired by origami, I believe. So a lot of the clothes were not modular, but you could button them in different ways to create different shapes, and you could just wear them in a lot of different ways. They also, again, I want to say this is like a 50s thing. It's kind of like a 1940s, 1950s workwear kind of vibe, where they have these big boxy tops that are cropped at the waist and then the long trouser. Anyway, maybe I'm totally seeing things that aren't there. It's a Japanese designer. He's just having a lot of fun with the construction of these clothes, and I would love to see them in person, because I feel like the pictures are just not doing them justice. Also, he's got this same solid blue color button down. I don't know why it's a trend right now, but I swear it is. His button down in this color is a little bit more satiny, a little bit more lustrous. Then there was Wales Bonner. She did not do a show, but she did a lookbook. She worked with a Chicago-based artist, Theaster Gates, and focused on this conceptual project, the Black Image Corporation. So she uses these images that are selected from the Johnson Publishing Company to take these beautiful pictures of Black women from these Black-focused publications like Ebony and Jet, and then she made these wonderful prints out of them. The only thing I want to shout out here is she is not doing a take on the duffel coat, but she is doing a take on the fireman clasp coat, which I also mentioned in my duffel coat video. It's just another interesting clasp to play with. And she also has this little cropped leather jacket, again, that like band around the waist to highlight the waist. And she's doing the neck to cuff connection. So she has the little furry thing at the neck, and then she has the little same texture down at the cuff. I've been thinking about this because I have one sweater that's sort of a turtleneck, and it has a little bit of an interesting lacy texture at the neck and the cuffs. And so when I wear it, I like for those things to sort of peek out and mirror each other. So I definitely feel these designers being focused on that. Kiko Kostadinov also very much focused on particular artistic references. He was referencing this artist, Kon Trubkovich, whose paintings inspired this sort of textile manipulation, as well as the colors that he chose. He also seems to have drawn inspiration from this black and white Hungarian film from 1988 called Damnation, because his show notes started with a quote from the movie, "I cling to nothing, but everything clings to me." This collection is beautiful. Again, you see some of these all-check, all-plaid outfits. You also see jackets with that high collar, like I said again, that high neck look. But his stuff overall is pretty unique to him. I did like these little scarves. It's not like they were a circle scarf. I don't know. They were cute. I liked the way they were styled. And finally, I wanted to shout out Bianca Saunders. She also did some really beautiful striped knits, which I love and I would love to own. I'm definitely focused on stripes in my life. Seems like Auralee is focused on stripes. Seems like she's focused on stripes. I would love to see more stripes. This show was called Dichotomy, and her show notes said it was about two opposing forces that, when combined, create something entirely new. She apparently had been watching a lot of archival videos of Jamaican dancers, and so there's very much the idea of movement in these pieces, and said she was drawn to the idea of repetition in dance moves, where sequences are built on simplicity, yet come together to create something intricate, intentional, whilst forming a cohesive routine. You can sort of see that in the clothes, that they're almost mid-movement. She worked with the artist Shanti Bell to actually create those lines that give the sense of movement. One funny little fashion thing is that she also references Robert Longo's Men in Cities photo series, which, if I recall correctly, there was a Nicole Kidman cover photo that also was inspired by that series. So something's in the water. I looked through those photographs myself and I think they're wonderful. I would love to learn more about him and his art. So those were my thoughts about how Paris Fashion Men's Week has been interacting with current events and current trends. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. What did you like? What did you not like? What stood out to you? And thank you again for watching.